7 words, just 7 words spoken by Prince William have just detonated a political bomb underneath what remains of Keir Starmer's crumbling government and sent the entire British establishment into the most extraordinary panic we have ever witnessed. 1 minute ago, news broke that the Prince of Wales, the future King of England, the man who will one day wear the crown and lead this nation, looked directly at the cameras and said something so powerful, so unexpected, so constitutionally explosive that Westminster has been thrown into absolute chaos. Politicians are scrambling, cabinet ministers are holding emergency meetings, constitutional experts are being called into television studios to explain what just happened. And Starmer's already devastated government, still reeling from resignations, leaked documents, broken promises, and a complete collapse of public trust, has just received the most devastating blow imaginable. Because when a future king speaks out, when the heir to the British throne breaks with centuries of royal tradition to say something that challenges the government directly, it doesn't just create a political crisis, it creates a constitutional crisis. It signals that even the institution that has stayed above politics for generations has reached its absolute limit. It tells the British people something they've been sensing for months but haven't seen confirmed so dramatically until this moment, that Starmer's government has failed so completely, so comprehensively, so catastrophically that even the royal family can no longer stay silent. Those 7 words are already being called the most consequential sentence spoken by any member of the royal family since the abdication crisis of 1936. They're being analysed by constitutional scholars, political commentators, former prime ministers, and millions of ordinary citizens who understand instinctively that something fundamental has just shifted in British politics. The reaction has been instantaneous and overwhelming. Social media has absolutely exploded, with people sharing the clip, debating the meaning and expressing shock that the future king has entered the political arena in such a dramatic fashion. Opposition politicians are using William's words as a rallying cry. Veterans organisations, free speech advocates, Brexit supporters and citizens from every walk of life who have been fighting against Starmer's authoritarian and dishonest government are pointing to this moment as proof that they've been right all along. Even people who normally defend the current government are struggling to explain away what William said. Because you cannot dismiss the future King of England as a political operative or a partisan attack dog. You cannot accuse him of being motivated by personal ambition or party loyalty. When Prince William speaks, he speaks with the authority of the institution he represents and with the moral weight of someone who has no political agenda except the well-being of the nation he will one day lead. And what he said about that nation's well-being under Starmer's government was absolutely damning. The government's response has been pathetic and revealing. Downing Street issued a brief statement saying they respect the royal family, but that constitutional conventions require separation between the monarchy and political governance. But everyone can see through that response. It's an attempt to put William back in his box, to reassert the principle that royals don't do politics, precisely because what William said was so politically devastating that the government desperately needs it to go away. But it won't go away. You cannot put this genie back in the bottle. 7 words have changed everything, and by the time you finish watching this video, you'll understand exactly why Prince William said what he said, what it means for Britain's immediate political future, and why Starmer's government is now on the absolute brink of total and final collapse. This is the moment everything changes again. Stay with me. Let me give you the full context of what Prince William said and why those 7 specific words have triggered such an extraordinary political and constitutional crisis, because understanding the background makes the moment even more explosive than it appears on the surface. Prince William was attending the annual ceremony honouring British veterans at the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire. It was supposed to be a solemn, apolitical event focused on honouring those who served and sacrificed for Britain. William was there in his capacity as future head of the armed forces, a role he takes with absolute seriousness given his own military service and his deep personal commitment to the welfare of veterans and serving military personnel. He spent years building relationships with veterans organisations and military families. He understands their struggles firsthand. And he'd been watching with growing alarm as Starmer's government slashed the very support services that help veterans survive and rebuild their lives after service. Tom Hardy had spoken out about this. Veterans organisations had protested. Opposition politicians had raised the issue in Parliament, but nothing had changed. The cuts remained. The broken promises remained. The veterans kept suffering, and William kept hearing their stories directly, kept seeing the impact of government neglect firsthand, kept meeting families who were struggling because the support they had been promised no longer existed. The ceremony proceeded as planned, with speeches from military officials and veteran representatives. William delivered a prepared address that honoured fallen service members and praised the courage of those who serve. It was moving and appropriate and entirely uncontroversial. And then came the moment that changed everything. As William was finishing his prepared remarks, a veteran in the audience, a double amputee, who had lost both legs to an IED in Afghanistan, called out from the crowd. He didn't shout anything aggressive or disruptive. He simply called out the name of a veteran's mental health programme that had been shut down due to Starmer's budget cuts, a programme that had saved his life and the lives of dozens of other veterans he knew personally. He called out that name and then said quietly, but clearly enough for nearby microphones to pick up, they shut it down. Just those 4 words from a veteran who had sacrificed everything for his country, describing the elimination of the programme that had helped him survive coming home from war. The crowd went silent. William paused. And then, after what witnesses describe as a moment of visible internal struggle, the future King of England departed from his prepared text and spoke the 7 words that have ignited a royal rebellion, the likes of which Britain has never seen. Those 7 words were, "This must not stand, we demand better." 7 words, short, direct, unambiguous. And in the context of a future king speaking at a veterans ceremony about a programme eliminated by the current government, those 7 words constitute one of the most powerful political statements made by a member of the royal family in living memory. Because William wasn't just expressing sympathy. He wasn't offering platitudes about the importance of veterans' support in the abstract. He was directly and explicitly condemning a specific government decision and demanding that it be reversed. He was using the moral authority of his position to challenge the political authority of the Prime Minister. He was doing something that members of the royal family simply do not do in modern Britain. And he was doing it in public, on camera, in front of thousands of people, including dozens of journalists who were broadcasting the ceremony. Well, the immediate reaction in the crowd was extraordinary. Veterans who were present began applauding, many of them in tears. Military families embraced each other and shouted their agreement with William's statement. Even some of the ceremony's official organisers, who were clearly caught off guard by the departure from the planned programme, began nodding visibly. There was a sense of collective release, of finally having someone in a position of real authority say what everyone knew, but what the established political order had prevented from being said clearly and powerfully enough to create real change. William himself appeared to understand the significance of what he had just done. After speaking the 7 words, he paused again and then added in a quieter voice, but still clearly audible, that he spoke as a servant of the people who serve this nation and that their sacrifice demands our very best in return. Then he stepped back from the podium and the ceremony continued, but nothing was the same as it had been before those 7 words. The constitutional implications became apparent almost immediately to everyone who understood how the British system works. The monarchy operates under a principle of strict political neutrality that has been carefully maintained for generations. Monarchs and senior royals do not comment on specific government policies. They do not criticise ministers or prime ministers. They do not take sides in political controversies, however justified that might be morally or however much they might personally disagree with government decisions. This tradition exists for good reasons. The monarchy derives its authority and stability from being above politics, from being a unifying national institution that transcends partisan divisions. The moment the royal family becomes politically partisan, it becomes a political actor subject to political attacks, and the institution itself is endangered. William knows all of this better than anyone. He's been raised with these principles. He's observed his grandmother maintain extraordinary political discipline for decades. He understands that what he just did has consequences not just for the current political situation, but for the institution he will one day lead. And yet he did it anyway. That decision made in that moment of moral conviction tells you everything about how serious the situation has become and how thoroughly Starmer's government has failed the people it's supposed to serve. When a future king concludes that the moral imperative to speak out outweighs the institutional imperative to stay silent, you know the situation has reached crisis point. You know that what's happening isn't just political disagreement or policy debate, but something that strikes at the fundamental values and obligations that define what Britain is supposed to be. And the British people understand this intuitively. They may not be able to articulate the constitutional theory of royal neutrality, but they know that when Prince William breaks from centuries of tradition to speak out at a veterans ceremony, it means something has gone very, very wrong. The government's attempt to frame William's statement as a momentary emotional response that shouldn't be interpreted as political commentary has been completely rejected by the public and most commentators. Some constitutional scholars are suggesting William may have technically violated conventions that govern royal conduct in relation to politics. Others argue that the conventions are flexible enough to allow senior royals to express general support for veterans without it constituting specific political commentary. But this debate is largely irrelevant because the political impact of William's words is already so profound that technical constitutional arguments cannot contain it. What matters is what ordinary people heard when their future king said those 7 words. They heard validation of everything they've been feeling and saying about how veterans have been betrayed. They heard moral authority supporting their own anger and frustration. They heard someone they trust and respect confirm that yes, this government has failed. Yes, better is demanded. Yes, this must not stand. That validation from the future king is worth more politically than any poll, any protest, any speech. And Starmer's government knows it, which is why they're terrified. The specific policy failure that triggered William's intervention, the elimination of veterans' mental health programmes, is also worth examining in detail because it shows the human cost behind the political controversy. The programme that the veteran called out was called the Frontline Minds Initiative, a specialised mental health support service specifically designed for veterans dealing with combat trauma, PTSD, and the complex psychological aftermath of military service. It was considered one of the most effective veteran support programmes in Europe. It provided one-to-one therapy, group support, family counselling and crisis intervention services to veterans who couldn't get adequate help through standard NHS mental health services, which are simply not equipped to deal with the specific psychological issues created by combat experience. The programme had documented extraordinary outcomes. Veterans who completed the programme showed significant improvements in mental health indicators. Suicide rates among participants were dramatically lower than the general veteran population. Many veterans who had been unable to work or maintain relationships before entering the programme were able to rebuild functioning lives afterward. The human impact was profound and well documented, and Starmer's government eliminated its funding entirely in the budget cuts that Tom Hardy had called out. Not reduced, not restructured, eliminated, gone. The veterans who were partway through treatment were given notice that the programme was ending. Those who hadn't yet accessed the programme were told it was no longer available. In some cases, veterans in active crisis were left without the specialised support that was keeping them stable, creating immediate risk to their lives. This is the reality behind the political controversy. These are the people William was speaking for when he said those 7 words. And knowing these details makes his intervention not just constitutionally significant, but morally essential. The political fallout from William's 7 words has been fast-moving, Comprehensive and absolutely devastating for Starmer's already crippled government. Within an hour of the ceremony footage spreading across social media, every major opposition party had issued statements. The responses were carefully worded to respect constitutional conventions around the monarchy while simultaneously using William's moral authority to maximum political effect. Reform UK's statement was the most direct, essentially saying that when the future King of England demands better for veterans, any government that doesn't immediately respond has proven its complete unfitness for office. The Conservative statement was more measured, but equally damning, pointing out that this was an unprecedented expression of concern from the royal family that demands immediate government action on veterans' support. The Liberal Democrats issued a statement expressing deep respect for William's evident commitment to veterans and calling for an emergency parliamentary debate on veterans funding. All three parties then did something unusual. They coordinated to table a joint emergency motion in Parliament demanding the immediate restoration of veterans' mental health funding. This kind of cross-party coordination is extremely rare in British politics, where the different opposition parties are normally competing against each other as much as against the government. But William's intervention had created a moment of genuine political unity around an issue where the public sympathies are overwhelmingly clear. The joint motion put Labour in an impossible position. If they voted against it, they would be seen as defying not just opposition politicians, but the moral authority expressed by the future king. If they voted for it, they'd be admitting their budget cuts were wrong and opening the door to demands for reversals of other cuts. If they abstained, they'd look weak and uncommitted. Every option was bad. Inside the Labour Party, the reaction to William's words was one of absolute horror. MPs who represent constituencies with large military populations immediately understood the political devastation this would cause. Several gave interviews expressing personal support for the substance of William's statement, carefully avoiding direct criticism of the government while making clear they believed veterans deserved better support. This barely disguised rebellion within Labour's own ranks showed how isolated Starmer had become even from members of his own party. The whipping operation that's supposed to keep Labour MPs voting with the government on controversial issues was apparently telling MPs to stay quiet and let the story blow over. But many MPs were ignoring that instruction because they knew that being on the wrong side of veterans' issues, especially now with the future king having added his voice to the demand for better, was electoral suicide. The social media reaction was extraordinary in its scale and emotional intensity. Clips of William's 7 words were viewed tens of millions of times within hours, veterans sharing their own stories of how the eliminated programmes had helped them or their colleagues flooded every platform. Military families expressed gratitude that someone in William's position had spoken out. Ordinary citizens who'd previously been only vaguely aware of the veterans' funding cuts were suddenly engaged and outraged. And perhaps most significantly, people who usually express cynicism about the royal family and question the monarchy's relevance in modern Britain were expressing genuine admiration for William's courage in speaking out. His 7 words created a remarkable moment of national unity across traditional political and cultural divides, with people from left and right, monarchists and Republicans all agreeing that what he said was right and that the government should act. The media coverage was unlike anything that's been seen in years. Every television channel led with the story. Every newspaper had it as their front page. Even international media that typically pays only passing attention to British domestic politics was running major stories. The BBC found itself in the unusual position of having to balance coverage of a member of the royal family, making what was clearly a political statement against their protocols for royal coverage, which typically treat royal engagements as non-political ceremonial events. They handled it by bringing in constitutional experts, former senior royals, advisors and political analysts to discuss what William's statement meant rather than treating it as a straightforward news story. The resulting coverage was actually more impactful than simple news reporting because it brought in voices that explained the constitutional significance in ways that gave the story enormous weight. Sky News was more straightforward, leading with the political implications and inviting opposition politicians to react to William's words directly. Several of those politicians were visibly emotional when discussing what the future king had said, particularly MPs who have military backgrounds or who have been closely involved in veterans advocacy. The sight of politicians being moved to tears while discussing William's intervention reinforced the sense that this moment was different, more significant, more morally serious than normal political controversy. Across all the coverage, one theme emerged consistently. Starmer's government had created a crisis so severe that it had broken through the careful neutrality of the royal family and forced the future king to speak out. That is an extraordinary indictment, and every hour of media coverage hammered that indictment home to millions of viewers who were just learning about the severity of the veterans' funding cuts. The government's handling of the media response was disastrously inept and made things considerably worse. The first statement from Downing Street, which tried to suggest William's words shouldn't be interpreted politically, was immediately demolished by journalists and commentators who pointed out that 7 words specifically referring to a government policy decision and explicitly demanding better are pretty unambiguously political, regardless of who says them. The second statement, which claimed the government had always been committed to veterans and was constantly reviewing ways to improve support, was mocked as incompatible with a 30% cut to mental health services and the complete elimination of the Frontline Minds initiative. A third attempt to get ahead of the story, which leaked word to sympathetic journalists that the government was considering reinstating some veterans funding, looked like panic management rather than principled policy change and was treated accordingly. The impression created was of a government completely wrong-footed by an unprecedented political intervention, flailing around trying different messages without any coherent strategy, more concerned with limiting political damage than with actually addressing the real problem. That impression is probably accurate because the reality is that no political communications team has ever had to develop a strategy for responding to the future King of England, demanding better treatment for veterans at a nationally broadcast ceremony. There's no playbook for this situation, and the government's improvised responses have all made things worse rather than better. One particular misstep was especially damaging. A junior government spokesperson, apparently trying to be helpful, made comments suggesting that William should have raised his concerns through appropriate channels rather than making public statements. This was immediately seized on by opposition politicians, Ottins and commentators as the government telling the future king to shut up and stay in his lane. The backlash was ferocious and swift, forcing a rapid clarification from Downing Street that the government deeply respected Prince William and that no criticism of his conduct was intended, but the damage was done. For several hours, the story was about the government telling the heir to the throne to mind his own business, which played catastrophically with a public that overwhelmingly supported William's intervention. The veterans community response has been emotionally overwhelming and politically powerful. Veterans organisations that had been quietly advocating for restoration of funding suddenly found themselves at the centre of national attention with the moral authority of the future king behind their cause. The Royal British Legion, which had been carefully diplomatic in its previous statements about funding cuts, issued a statement after William's intervention that was notably more direct and demanding than anything it had previously said. Smaller veterans charities were even more explicit, issuing statements that directly called on the government to immediately restore the eliminated programmes and to develop a comprehensive veterans support strategy that matches the commitment that service members made to the country.